There were things the body remembered that the mind chose to forget. On a frigid morning in late February, beneath the sterile lights of St. Francis Medical Center, a body remembered something it had buried for over 7 decades. It spoke not in words, but in resistance, a sudden metallic protest beneath a scalpel's path. The operating room had been quiet humming only with the muted rhythm of machines and murmured instructions. That silence cracked when Dr. Bernard Harlow's blade struck metal, a sharp clink, a pause, a collective breath held by everyone in the room. It was supposed to be a routine orthopedic procedure, a knee replacement on an elderly patient suffering from degenerative joint disease. But this patient was different. Frank Dawson, 89 years old. World War II veteran widower. Father of one resident of Lake Erie's most weathered little house, and until today, medically unremarkable. Dr. Harlow stepped back. His brow furrowed beneath his surgical cap as the image on the monitor flashed through his mind the ghostly blur he'd dismissed as an artifact. Something about it had felt odd, yes, but nothing alarming. That changed now. Retract the fascia. He instructed his voice low and steady. The assistant obeyed carefully, peeling back the tissue to reveal the foreign object, dull silver, warped and deeply embedded behind the kneecap. The thing looked ancient, as if it had lived 100 years inside the man without making a sound. Its shape was no longer sharp, but rounded by time like a stone smoothed by water. Jagged edges peeked out where bone had grown around it protectively. Dr. Harlow leaned closer. "That's not medical hardware," he murmured. The scrub nurse beside him shifted nervously. "Should I call pathology?" He nodded. "Yes. And imaging. We'll need a full assessment." They continued the procedure with care, preserving the integrity of the object. It would be removed, but not without documentation, not without answers. Because now the question wasn't just how the patient walked with pain, but how he had walked at all. Frank Dawson lay still under anesthesia, unaware that his body had whispered a secret to strangers. A secret so old it had become a part of him, woven into flesh and bone. The monitors beeped, steady and slow. Life marched on moment by moment, unaware it had just become extraordinary. Outside the OR, snow blanketed the world in quiet. The hospital windows, frosted and gray, reflected nothing but clouds. Nurses moved through the corridors like muted ghosts, pushing carts and checking vitals. Life in a hospital never shouted. It whispered like a long breath that never quite ended. Frank had come in alone. No family at bedside. No emergency contacts listed except for a handwritten name, Leo Dawson. No relationship stated. No phone number, Dr. Harlow had seen it before. Elderly men arriving alone, their histories clutched inside them like relics. But something about Frank lingered in the mind. Maybe it was the stillness in his eyes during the pre-op consultation, the way he'd answered questions without elaboration, or the way his gaze had drifted when asked about past injuries. Nothing worth remembering, Frank had said, and that had been that. But the body remembers. The body always remembers. 2 hours later, Dr. Harlow sat in his office reviewing imaging results with furrowed brows. The object measured just under 3 centimeters in length, lodged deep within the joint capsule. The scan revealed it had caused mild erosion of surrounding bone over decades, but not enough to force intervention. It had been there for a long, long time. He turned to the pathology report just delivered. The object was composed primarily of oxidized steel, consistent with 1940s munitions fragments. World War II era, likely German in origin, possibly from an MG-42 round commonly used during the Sicilian campaign. Dr. Harlow exhaled. Frank hadn't just been a soldier. He'd been a man who walked away from something brutal and never looked back, or rather, never let himself be seen looking back. This fragment had lived in him not just physically, but psychologically. Not removed, not discussed, not treated. Buried. Frank awoke several hours later, groggy and slow to orient. The recovery nurse spoke gently, adjusting his IV line. "You're out of surgery, Mr. Dawson. Everything went well." He nodded, faintly, eyes unfocused. A pause. Then, in a voice rasped with age, "What did you find?" The nurse hesitated. "The doctor will speak to you soon." Frank turned his face away toward the window. Outside, the snow continued its descent uninterrupted, like time folding over itself. Later that evening, Dr. Harlow visited the room. Frank sat, propped upright, wrapped in hospital white, his frame gaunt but composed. His gaze was sharp now, clearer than it had been all day. "We found something unusual," Harlow said. "A piece of metal lodged behind your knee. Old. From the war, most likely." Frank didn't flinch. He looked at the doctor for a long moment before responding. "I know," he said simply. That was all. No questions, no surprise. "You knew it was there," Frank nodded once. "Why didn't you have it removed?" Frank's eyes drifted again, this time toward the floor. Didn't see the point. Dr. Harlow wanted to ask more. He wanted to know what it meant to carry something like that through peace and marriage, through fatherhood and grief, through the stillness of an empty house by the lake. But he didn't ask. Instead, he said, "We kept it. If you'd like to see it." Frank shook his head. "Not yet." Silence stretched between them, and then Dr. Harlow added, "Your son was listed as your emergency contact. Should we inform him?" Frank's face stiffened. "He won't come." The doctor waited. "I haven't spoken to him in years," Frank said. "He blames me. He should." Dr. Harlow said nothing. "There are wounds no scalpel can touch." He stood. "Rest for now. We'll talk more tomorrow." As he left, Frank reached for the small notebook on the bedside table. Its pages were blank, but he flipped it open anyway and stared at the white expanse for a long, long time. Some houses don't creak because they're old. They creak because they've been waiting too long to be lived in. Frank Dawson's house stood on the eastern edge of Lake Erie, where the water turned silver at dusk and the wind always came from the west. It was modest, a one-story wooden frame with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the side facing the lake. The shutters were worn paint-peeling. The windows never let in enough light. Inside, it smelled faintly of tobacco wood polish and something older. A scent of time, perhaps. Frank hadn't lit a fire in weeks. The winter had lingered longer this year, and yet he found no urgency to chase the cold away. The silence wrapped around him like a shawl he couldn't quite shed. Stacks of yellowed newspapers filled the corners. A cracked photograph of Clara Whitmore rested on the mantel beside a faded American flag folded into a perfect triangle. He dusted around both, daily never touching either. The only room he truly inhabited was the kitchen, where a single mug lived in the sink and the kettle whined faintly from rust. Meals were simple oatmeal black coffee, sometimes canned soup. Once a week, a neighbor dropped off groceries. She never stayed long. Frank didn't mind. The quiet had become his companion, even if it pressed too close at times. 3 days had passed since the surgery. The hospital had released him early, partly due to his insistence, partly because he hadn't developed complications. Dr. Sir. Harlow had given him painkillers and instructions. Frank had only nodded. When the cab dropped him off, the driver offered to help him inside. "I've got it," Frank said with a tone that ended the conversation. He moved slowly, cane tapping on the icy steps, pausing only to unlock the door with hands stiff from both weather and age. Inside, the stillness greeted him like an old friend. He sat in his chair by the window and listened to the lake breathe. In the living room, a box from the hospital sat unopened. Inside was the fragment wrapped in clear plastic, sealed, labeled with his name and the date of removal. Frank stared at it from across the room but made no move to touch it. He already knew what it looked like. He had felt it every time he knelt to bury a rose bush. Every time he twisted his knee in the garden. Every time Clara asked why he limped worse in spring. He had always said it was arthritis. She had known better, but never pressed. Clara had a way of hearing what he didn't say and loving him anyway. That was the cruel part about losing her. Not the absence, but the memory of being known. He rose finally and made his way to the bedroom. The second drawer of the dresser creaked when he opened it. Beneath folded undershirts, he pulled out a small wooden box. Its lock was old, but functional. He hadn't opened it in 40 years. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of everything inside. The lid lifted. Photographs, dog tags, letters never mailed, and one envelope addressed in smudged ink to the family of PFC, James Jimmy Hayes. Never sent, never burned. The letter inside was short, honest, cowardly. I was the one who told him to take the ridge alone. I was the one who froze when he called for cover fire. I told the officer it was fog, that I didn't see. But I saw everything. Frank closed the box. Some wounds weren't meant to be cleaned, just carried. The knock at the door was soft but firm. Frank tensed. No one visited unannounced. He waited, hoping they'd go away. But the knock came again. He stood slowly, bracing himself on the cane, and shuffled to the door. When he opened it, he saw a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 7 years. Leo Frank said flatly, "Dad." The wind howled between them like a third presence. "You came. You had surgery. The hospital called. I figured someone should check in." Frank stepped aside. "You want coffee?" Leo hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." They moved like strangers in a room that used to hold echoes of familiarity. Leo took a seat at the kitchen table, tracing the scratches in the wood. Frank moved with deliberate slowness, boiling water, spooning out grounds. "You didn't have to come," Frank muttered. Leo shrugged. "Didn't have much choice. Your name was still down as my emergency contact, too." Frank poured the coffee. No sugar, no milk. He slid the mug across the table like a peace offering that neither of them wanted to accept. "I'm fine," Frank said. "You're almost 90. I've been almost 90 for a while now." They sat in silence, the only sound the clink of Leo's ring against the ceramic. "You gonna ask how I'm doing?" Leo finally said. "I just did. No, you asked why I came, not how I've been." Frank didn't respond. He looked down at his hands. They looked older than he remembered, more like his father's than his own. Leo took a breath. "You missed Mom's funeral." Frank flinched just slightly. "She died asking for you, I know. Do you?" Frank looked up, his voice cracked, barely audible. "I do." The room fell silent again, but this silence was different, thicker, heavier. Not the comfortable kind Frank had grown used to. This one had weight, and a pulse. Leo stood, walked to the mantel, picked up the folded flag, held it like something sacred and volatile. "She wanted you to let it go. Whatever it was you were carrying." Frank didn't answer. Leo turned. "But you never did. Did you?" Frank shook his head. "I couldn't." Night fell early. Leo stayed not because he wanted to, but because he didn't want to leave things as they were. They spoke little over dinner. Frank reheated soup. Leo accepted it, like two men acting out a ritual neither believed in anymore. Before bed, Leo found the hospital box on the table. "What's this?" Frank didn't look up. A souvenir. Leo peeled back the lid. Inside, the warped piece of metal, dull, cold, inert. But something about it chilled him. He turned to his father. "This was in you," Frank nodded. "For how long, 76 years? Leo swallowed. "Why didn't you ever—" "Because it was supposed to stay there," Frank said. "It was penance." Leo looked at him like he was seeing him for the first time. "You kept it. On purpose." Frank nodded. Leo sat down hard. He didn't know whether to be angry or devastated. He only knew he didn't understand. Yet. The night sank into the house like a cold breath, silent and slow. Leo Dawson couldn't sleep. Not in that house. Not after what he had seen, what he had touched. He lay on the couch in the living room, still in the same clothes, a folded blanket over his chest. The fire had long since gone out. The warped fragment of metal, the memento his father had carried inside him for decades, rested on the table, just feet away, wrapped in clear plastic like an exhibit in a museum of pain. He stared at it for a long time, and the thought kept spinning in his head. Why would someone willingly carry a wound? At dawn, he rose, and the floorboards creaked beneath his steps as he moved toward the hallway. The air in the house was heavy, as though the walls themselves had held their breath for years and only now exhaled in fragments. In Frank's bedroom, the bed was neatly made. No sign of movement. Just a cane propped against the wall and a cup of water on the nightstand. But Leo wasn't looking for his father. Not yet. He walked to the dresser, pulled open the second drawer. Nothing inside looked remarkable at first glance: shirts, socks, the usual orderliness of a man who lived alone. But Leo had grown up in this house. He remembered the squeak the drawer made when you pulled too far, the way his mother used to say, "Leave your father's things be, sweetheart. Some drawers aren't meant to open." But he opened it anyway. Beneath a layer of undershirts was a wooden box, old and locked. The grain was dark, and there was something almost ceremonial about it, as if it didn't belong with laundry and medicine bottles. Leo hesitated. He didn't have a key, but when he lifted the box, it clicked softly unlocked, as though it had been waiting. Inside, he found photographs creased and yellowed. One of a young Frank in uniform, eyes distant even then. Another of two men laughing by a river, shirtless, cigarettes in hand, faces young and wild. On the back, Sicily, 43, me and Jimmy. Then came the letters, dozens. Most of them from Clara, elegant cursive, smudged with time, filled with affection. And at the very bottom a single envelope, tattered, unsent. To the family of PFC, James Jimmy Hayes. Leo didn't mean to open it. He only meant to hold it. But the seal had worn away. It came undone with the gentlest touch. The letter inside was short, stiff, handwritten in block letters. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, your son was my best friend. He died bravely. He died quickly. But the truth is, he died because of me. He volunteered for a scouting position on the ridge, and I approved it. I was supposed to cover him, but I froze when the first shots came. I didn't fire back. I didn't move. I just watched. I told our commanding officer that I couldn't see through the fog, but the truth is, I saw everything. I was the last one to hold his hand. I was the last to see him breathe. I have carried this in silence. I thought it would fade, but it hasn't. It never does. I am sorry. Frank Dawson. Leo sat motionless, the letter trembling in his fingers. His father hadn't just kept the metal in his knee, he had kept something far heavier in his chest. A secret, a guilt, a silence so dense it had swallowed their family whole. It wasn't just emotional distance, it was penance. And now Leo saw it all, how Frank had become a man of few words because his truest words could never be spoken. He heard the screen door creak open. Frank was outside, standing at the edge of the porch, staring at the lake like it owed him something. Leo stepped out behind him, still holding the letter. You never sent it, he said. Frank didn't turn. No, he replied. Why? Frank was quiet for a long time. Because I was a coward then, he said, and I stayed one. Leo approached slowly. You let Mom die thinking she didn't know who you were. She knew, Frank said. His voice cracked. That was the problem. Leo's eyes filled with something hot and unspoken. You raised me like I was a ghost, like I might vanish if I asked too many questions. I couldn't afford answers, Frank whispered. Not the real ones. You lived. He didn't. And instead of honoring that you turned yourself into a shadow, Frank looked down at his hands. I wasn't supposed to come back from Sicily, he said. The plan was to go up together, cover each other, die if necessary. But when Jimmy called out, I froze. Leo's voice softened. You were 20. I was trained. You were human. Frank swallowed hard. I kept the bullet because I didn't deserve to forget. Leo sat beside him, the letter still between his fingers. Mom forgave you, he said quietly. Even without knowing everything, she was kinder than I ever deserved. And me. Frank turned toward his son. The look on his face wasn't one of expectation. It was surrender. You don't have to forgive me, he said. But you should know. Everything I didn't say, it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I couldn't carry it all and still be a good father. Leo stared out at the water. The wind had picked up, ruffling the bare branches and whispering through the empty air. I always wondered why you limped worse when spring came, he said. Frank almost smiled. Every year. Around the anniversary. Leo nodded. They sat together for a while, not speaking. But for the first time in decades, their silence felt shared not like a wall but like a space held between two men who had finally seen each other clearly. The night, Leo didn't sleep on the couch. He slept in the guest room in the bed that had been his childhood refuge. Frank sat alone in the living room reading one of Clara's old letters, her handwriting curled like vines looping gently across the page. I know you carry more than you say. Just promise me that one day you'll let someone help carry it with you. He folded the letter and looked at the box. The hospital fragment was still on the table, but this time it didn't seem like a wound. It looked like a chapter, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to turn the page. Frank Dawson awoke to quiet, but it wasn't the kind he knew. This silence had a weight to it. Not the peaceful hush of a solitary morning, but the heavy emptiness that follows after something has been broken open and left exposed. Leo was gone. The guest bed lay untouched. The car tracks on the snowy driveway had faded in the night, but Frank knew they had been there. A silent departure. No note, no confrontation, just the unmistakable echo of absence. Frank didn't blame him. Truth had a way of pushing people away before it ever brought them closer. The house felt colder without Leo. Frank moved slowly through the rooms, nursing his rebuilt knee with each step, the absence of the fragment making him feel strangely hollow. The pain was gone, but in its place was an unfamiliar lightness that didn't feel like relief. It felt like vulnerability. For over 70 years, he had walked with that weight inside him. He had built his life around it. And now, without it, he wasn't sure who he was. He stood in the hallway staring at the photo of Clara. Her eyes, forever soft, seemed to see through him, as if she were still waiting for him to finish what she had started, to forgive himself. The knock on the door came mid-morning. Frank wasn't expecting anyone. Most of the neighborhood kept to themselves, and after the long winter, few dared brave the icy road to the lake. When he opened the door, Dr. Allison Vega stood before him. She was bundled against the cold, her breath fogging as she smiled gently. In her gloved hands, she held a paper bag. I brought tea, she said. Thought you might not have had any company since being discharged. Frank blinked. You came all the way out here for tea? No, she replied. I came out for the silence. He stepped aside. They sat in the living room, a kettle humming on the stove behind them. Dr. Vega glanced at the framed photo of Clara, then at the folded flag, then back to Frank. I read your file, she said. I'm not supposed to say that, but... I did. Frank grunted. I suppose that makes two of us who know what's inside me. She shook her head. No, that makes one of us who knows what it's like to carry something invisible for decades. Frank met her gaze. My grandfather, she said softly. He was with the 442nd Infantry, Japanese-American unit, fought in Europe. Came back in 45 and never spoke a word about what happened. Not to his wife, not to my father, not to me. Frank stayed silent. He died of a stroke when I was 16, she continued. I remember sitting with him in the hospital hoping he'd wake up. I wanted to ask him why he never talked, why he always looked like he was still standing in a war zone. She paused. I never got to ask, but I think I understand now. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I wasn't trying to be cruel, he said. I thought silence was the only way to make peace with what I'd done. Dr. Vega nodded slowly. I used to think that too, but silence isn't peace. It's exile. The kettle whistled. She stood and moved to the kitchen, pouring hot water into 2 cups. The aroma of chamomile and dried citrus filled the space. Frank watched her hands steady, confident. They reminded him of Clara's when she would tend to the garden or slice apples for pie. Always careful, always present. Dr. Vega returned and handed him a cup. You said something in the hospital, she said, settling back into the chair, that your son wouldn't come, but he did. He left. Because you told him everything. Frank looked down, and maybe that was too much. Or maybe it was just enough, she said gently. Maybe this is where the healing starts. Not when we're forgiven, but when we're finally heard. Outside, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of dead grass and wet earth. The lake shimmered under a weak sun, the ice breaking into jagged shards that drifted like forgotten memories. Frank sipped his tea. "I used to think about writing a book," he said suddenly. Dr. Vega raised an eyebrow. "Not for publication," he clarified. "Just for myself, something to make sense of it all. But every time I sat down to write, the words felt hollow, like I was stealing from my own silence." And now, he stared out the window. "Now it feels like if I don't say it, it'll die with me." She smiled. "Then you should write." Frank looked over at the box on the table. The letter to Jimmy's family still rested inside. "I think I'll start by sending that," he said. Dr. Vega nodded. "And your son?" she asked. "I don't know." There was no bitterness in his voice, just something softer, something almost hopeful. "Maybe I'll send him a letter too." That evening, Frank sat by the fireplace and put pen to paper. The first words came slowly stilted, but then, like thawed rivers, they began to flow. "Dear Leo, I never told you who I was, only who I thought I had to be. But the truth is, I've been afraid of being seen, not as a soldier, not as your father, but as a man who made a mistake he never stopped reliving." The page filled line by line, memory by memory. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the fire crackled low, until the silence around him no longer felt like a prison, but a possibility. Across town, in a rented room above a bookstore, Leo sat with the unsent letter to the Hayes family in his lap. He hadn't meant to take it. He had slipped it into his coat pocket almost by instinct, unsure why. Now, under the dim light of a floor lamp, he read it again. Each word hit differently now. He saw his father not as a man who had shut him out, but as someone who had never known how to let himself in. For the first time, Leo felt something other than anger. He felt the echo of a boy who used to sit on his father's shoulders during 4th of July parades, who used to fall asleep on the porch swing to the sound of Clara humming lullabies, who used to believe silence was strength. But maybe strength was saying the thing that hurt. He pulled out a notepad. "Dad, I read the letter. I finally see it now. You weren't trying to disappear. You were trying not to be seen as the man you saw in the mirror. But I'm still here. And I think it's time we both stop being ghosts." He didn't know how to end it, so he didn't. Frank Dawson collapsed in the kitchen just after sunrise. The kettle had begun to whistle, but the cup in his hand never made it to the counter. His body gave way slow and sudden, like an old tree falling without a sound. The pain wasn't sharp. It was hollow, like a bell struck deep within his chest. He hit the floor hard. The ceramic cup shattered beside him. Steam rose mingling with the silence. For a moment there was nothing. No breath, no movement, no time. Just a man alone with the weight he had never truly released. The world that followed wasn't real, and yet it was more vivid than anything he had seen in years. He stood on the banks of a river, not the icy edge of Lake Erie, but a sun-warmed stream that cut through Sicilian hills, golden and quiet. The sky above was blue enough to hurt, and across the water stood Jimmy Hayes, 20 years old, smiling, shirt half unbuttoned, sleeves rolled. Alive. "Frank," Jimmy said like no time had passed. Frank opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The guilt came first, the shame, the weight. "I left you," he managed. Jimmy shrugged. "You hesitated. I watched you die. You were scared." Frank sank to his knees. "I carried it. All of it. I kept the bullet. I kept the silence. I tried to bury it inside me." Jimmy crossed the water without making a sound, sat beside him. "You didn't bury it," he said. "You built your life around it." Frank wept not from grief but from release. The tears came like rain after drought, soft and endless. "I don't know how to live without it," he whispered. Jimmy placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then start by forgiving the boy who froze." He was doing the best he could. Frank looked at him. "I didn't deserve to come home." Jimmy smiled. Maybe not, but you did. So do something with it. Frank closed his eyes. In the distance, he heard a sound like someone calling his name. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes after Dr. Ear. Vega, who had come to check on Frank and found him unconscious on the floor. She performed chest compressions until her arms burned, shouting into the void for him to return. He had no family listed, no nearby kin. But she had called Leo anyway. Leo arrived just as Frank was stabilized, pale and unconscious in a hospital bed. Tubes ran into his arms. A heart monitor beeped slow and steady. Dr. Vega met him at the entrance. He had a massive cardiac event, she said. He stopped breathing. If I hadn't come when I did... Leo swallowed hard. Is he... He's alive, she said. For now. They stood in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing between them. He was writing, she added, when I found him. There were letters on the table. Leo stepped into the room alone. Frank looked smaller now, fragile in a way Leo had never seen. The man who had once loomed silent and untouchable now seemed folded in on himself, held together by wires and grace. Leo sat beside him. For a while he said nothing. Then softly, I got your letter. Frank didn't respond. I wrote back. Still silence. Leo's voice cracked. Don't do this. Not now. Not after we finally started talking. A flicker, a twitch of the fingers. Then slowly, Frank's eyes opened. He blinked twice, groaned softly. His lips moved. Jimmy, Leo leaned closer. No, Dad. It's me. It's Leo. Frank stared at him for a long time, then whispered, You came back. Leo nodded, gripping his father's hand. I'm not done, Frank murmured. I still have things to say. Leo smiled through tears. Then say them. Frank recovered slowly over the following days. The doctors called it a miracle. At his age, survival after cardiac arrest was rare. But Frank defied statistics just as he had defied death on a ridge in Sicily decades ago. He asked for paper, a pen, a folder. He wrote letters to Jimmy's parents or their memory to Clara to Leo. Letters filled not with apology but with clarity. With a voice he had never let himself use until now. He let Leo read them. And for the first time, Leo didn't feel like a stranger visiting a ghost. He felt like a son. One afternoon, Frank turned to Leo. I want to go to the lake. Leo helped him dress, helped him into the car, drove the familiar road back to the house where so many silences had been kept. Frank moved slowly. Leaning on his cane, each step deliberate. They stood together at the edge of the frozen water where cracks had formed like lightning beneath the surface. Frank held a small velvet pouch in his hands. Inside the fragment. The bullet. The burden. He looked at Leo. Want to help me? Let it go, Leo nodded. Together they opened the pouch. Frank took a deep breath. The cold burned his lungs, but he welcomed it. With one slow motion, he let the metal fall. It hit the ice with a faint sound, rolled once, then slipped through a crack into the lake below. Gone. Spring came late that year. The ice melted in quiet surrender, revealing a lake no longer hardened by memory. The water breathed again, slow silver and alive. Frank Dawson stood on the porch of the house by the lake, the same one that had carried his silences for decades. But now it looked different. The shutters had been repainted. The porch had new steps. The flower beds, once barren, had been tilled and sown with Clara's favorite seeds, daffodils and bluebells. It was Leo's idea, not as an apology, not as a tribute, but as a beginning. They worked side by side most mornings. Frank in his chair with a blanket barking instructions. Leo with sleeves rolled, tools in hand. You always let the left hinge hang loose, Frank muttered one afternoon. Leo grinned. That's because you always told me to fix it and never showed me how. Frank lifted a brow. Well, now I'm showing you. So, pay attention. The banter was light, familiar, like a song they'd once known but hadn't sung in years. Sometimes they didn't speak at all, and that was fine too, because now the silence between them wasn't avoidance. It was peace. One Sunday, Leo arrived with a folded piece of paper, a notice, he said, from the community center. Frank took it, adjusted his glasses, and read aloud. Veterans and Voices Storytelling Series Honoring Unsung Heroes. Leo cleared his throat. They're asking for volunteers to share personal wartime stories. Survivors, soldiers, families, anyone willing to speak the truths that often get lost. Frank set the paper down. I'm no hero. Leo met his eyes. Maybe not. But you're one of the last voices left who remembers. Frank considered that. I've only ever spoken to ghosts. Then, maybe it's time to speak to the living. A week later, Frank entered the community center for the first time in years. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Teenagers leaned against walls. Parents and teachers waited quietly curious. Leo stood beside him. Frank walked slowly to the front. No microphone, just his voice. He cleared his throat. My name is Frank Dawson, he began. I served in Sicily in 1943. I came home with a medal I didn't earn and a silence I did. He paused. I want to tell you about a man named Jimmy Hayes. And he did. Not just about the day Jimmy died, but about who he was, how he laughed, how he sang off-key, how he once traded a week's rations for a stray dog he named Mortar, how he believed in coming home even when Frank didn't. And then, with eyes wet and voice steady, Frank said, I kept a piece of war inside me for 76 years. A metal shard. But that wasn't the real wound. The real wound was what I never said, what I thought couldn't be spoken. He looked at the children. Don't make my mistake. Say the things, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. The room was silent, but it wasn't empty. Afterward, a little girl with tangled hair approached Frank holding out a paper flower. For your friend Jimmy, she whispered. Frank took it, knees shaking, and whispered, Thank you. He would keep it beside the photograph of Clara. The next morning, Leo found his father in the backyard sitting beneath a maple tree. You okay? He asked. Frank smiled. Just listening. To what? The silence, Frank said. It sounds different now. Leo sat beside him. What do you hear? Frank closed his eyes. Not ghosts, he said. Just life. 3 weeks later, Frank mailed his final letter to the National Archives requesting Jimmy Hayes' name be added to a local memorial. He didn't need anyone to know what had really happened. He just needed the world to remember Jimmy's name. On a warm afternoon in June, they held a gathering by the lake. Just a few people. Neighbors, friends. A small table with 2 photographs, Clara in her sun hat, and Jimmy with his crooked smile. Frank gave a short speech. There's a kind of silence that heals, he said. It doesn't erase, it doesn't forget, but it lets you breathe again. Then he nodded at Leo. Together they scattered wildflower seeds along the edge of the lake. For Clara, for Jimmy, for the years that couldn't be reclaimed but could still be honored. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Frank leaned against the porch railing. Leo handed him a mug of tea. Chamomile. You know, Frank said if someone had told me a year ago I'd be planting flowers and telling war stories to school kids, I would have told them they'd lost their mind. Leo grinned. I probably would have agreed with them. They clinked mugs. The sky turned lavender above them. Frank sighed. You saved me, he said quietly. Leo shook his head. You just finally let yourself be found. Later that night, Frank sat at his old writing desk. One last letter, but this one wasn't to Jimmy or Clara or even Leo. It was to himself. Dear Frank, you were never the silence. You were just afraid of the sound of truth. But now you know broken men can still mend. And silence too can speak if we learn how to listen. Subscribe to Recalled by Hope channel to follow more stories like Frank's. Stories where pain finds peace and silence gives way to truth.